Thank you, Lawrence, for overly generous introduction. I have been at the Teacher Study Institute for 50 years. I must be a very conservative person. I've lived in the same house for 50 years, and I've been married to the same woman for 50 years. I don't know which is most atypical. I've promised to speak only for 25 minutes in this introduction. And I'll try to keep to that promise, but if not, I will make in any case, I'll make my PowerPoint presentation available, so you can look at the last slides for yourself. Oops. In this talk, I will argue that the frequency and the lethality of war is decreasing, and that other forms of violence tend to follow the same trajectory, that the decline of war is not at all linear or even monotonic, that there will be many setbacks and challenges to the waning of war. Climate change may be one of these challenges, but that climate change is unlikely to reverse the trend towards less violence. And that the main problem with climate change probably is the uncertainty that it generates. Obviously, we do not yet have a peaceful world. Since World War II, we have experienced 254 armed conflicts, and that includes all conflicts with more than 25 battle-related deaths, civilians and military, in a calendar year. These have occurred in 155 different countries and territories, and with no less than 548 different actors, states or insurgent movements. Obviously, in some countries you have several insurgencies going on even at the same time. And it includes civilians that are combatant, and it includes internal conflict as well as interstate conflicts. And in 2013, there were 33 ongoing conflicts in 25 countries. Oops. This is a graph that shows the number of ongoing armed conflicts after World War II. And we see that at the bottom here, these are what we call extra-state conflicts, colonial wars and so on. And since there are very few traditional colonies left, there are no recorded colonial conflicts since the mid-1970s. The black area, these are the number of interstate wars, and there have always been few interstate wars going on at the same time, although as we shall see in a minute, they can be quite serious. And in recent years, there have been several years with no interstate conflicts going on. So the dominant form of armed conflict has been civil war or internal armed conflict. And the white area, those are the internationalized civil conflicts with external interventions by means of troops and arms from the outside. What we see is that during most of the Cold War, there was an increase in the number of conflicts, mainly due to an increase in internal conflicts. This is a little bit deceptive, because this is of course the time of decolonization, when a lot of countries became independent, and we don't have very good records for internal conflicts in non-independent territories. So in part this is a reflection of the expansion of the state system. Of course, many of these new states were unstable and have experienced conflicts, so that's part of the story. The number of ongoing conflicts peaked right after the end of the Cold War, and then declined by about a third. And then for the past 15 years or so, it's been relatively stable with some ups and downs. And the one reason why there are so many ups and downs is that, of course, with a low threshold like 25 battle deaths, sometimes the conflicts will be active and next year will not be active, so this varies a little bit, but there's basically no change over the last 15 years. Now, these conflicts vary, of course, very drastically in size. And if we look at this graph, this shows the number of battle-related deaths in armed conflicts going back to the beginning of the 20th century. And we see here that two conflicts completely dominate the picture, and I'm not awarding any prize for guessing which two conflicts these are. we also see the battle deaths here have been divided between international conflicts, and which are blue, and intra-state conflicts, which are green. And we see that the deaths in international wars completely dominate the picture. World War II, World War I, but also since then. Now it's a little bit difficult to see what's going on after World War II because that peak is so high. So if we go to the next slide, we see the number of battle-related deaths in the period after World War II. And what we see here is that there is a clearly declining trend, and it's of course it's declining even more if you factor in World War II, but it's very much influenced by individual wars. So here's the Chinese Civil War, here's the Korean War, here is basically the Vietnam War. This peak is a combination of the Soviet war in Afghanistan and the Iran-Iraq war. And then we have other well-known conflicts out here, but with lower peaks than in the previous wars. Down here we have two different estimates for 2013, because the Uppsala Conflict Data Program that collects this data have been unable to establish what they call the best estimate for the conflict in Syria. So there's a low estimate and a high estimate for Syria, and so we see that there is an increasing trend in battle-related violence at the moment, but it's still at a much lower level than in the late 1970s, or not to speak of the Korean War. Now, there are a number of challenges to the thesis of decline of war. Some argue that, well, what we're seeing now is a secular peace, but in the future we will have a clash of civilizations. Conflict will be driven increasingly by religious clashes. There's the idea that what we're seeing at the moment is a unipolar peace, completely dominated by the United States and its allies, but that there will be new great power challenges to Western hegemony, and that these will lead to more conflict in the future. There's the idea that this is an unjust peace, and that inequalities will lead to new conflicts, and proletarians will arise at the international and the domestic level. And there's the idea that what we're seeing now is an unsustainable peace, that conflict in the future will be increasingly driven by environmental change. And I'll skip the other three, although you can ask questions about them if you want to, and talk only about the last one. And the question of a relationship between environmental change and conflict is an old one. It goes been an active research area since at least the late 1970s. But more recently, this has focused very much on climate change as the most serious form of environmental change. And a number of people have argued that there is a strong relationship here. Ban Ki-moon, the Secretary General of the UN, said that Darfur is the first of many climate wars. President Obama, in his Nobel Peace Prize address in 2009, said that there's little scientific dispute that if we do nothing, we will face more drought, more famine, more mass displacement, all of which will fuel more conflict for decades. I tend to think that he would have been more accurate if he said that there's little scientific agreement on any of this. And then the military establishment has chipped into climate change can act as a threat multiplier for instability, and this is a major national security challenge for the US, a statement by 11 retired US generals and admirals in 2007. And finally, the British newspaper The Independent and several other newspapers reported on the most recent IPCC report on the consequences of climate change. IPCC report paints bleak picture of war, famine and pestilence. A rather dramatic headline, which is not accurately reflected by the IPCC report, and not even by the Independent's own article if you read further down. So I'll get back to that. Whoops. So what is the relationship between global warming and conflict? If I had been a neo-Malthusian and perhaps a bit naive, then I might have said that, well, from 1946 to 1991, the number of conflicts went up, and temperature deviations also went up. So maybe there's some relationship here. Of course, if we then look at the next 20 years, we see that the number of conflicts is going down and the temperature is rising, so the relationship seems to be the reverse. What can we learn from this? Precisely nothing. But unfortunately, I'm presenting this because unfortunately sometimes the debate about climate change and conflict, about the effects of climate change generally, tend to be a little bit of this sort. That one thing's going up and other thing's going up, there must be a relationship. But of course we need to look much more carefully at the whether there are any plausible causal mechanisms and whether these can be established empirically. So how can we move from climate change to conflict in a theoretically meaningful way? One obvious scenario is that sea level rise will lead to extensive migration, and that this migration will lead to conflict in the host areas. And low-lying areas in South Asia, Bangladesh and so on are frequently mentioned as places where this might happen. Another common scenario is that drought will lead to resource scarcity, and that resource scarcity will lead to people fighting over essential necessities like food, land, water, and so on. A third possibility is that drought, rather than leading to local conflict, will lead to migration, and then, like sea level rise, it will lead to conflict in the areas that have to receive a large number of migrants. The drought scenarios are frequently mentioned with relevance to sub-Saharan Africa. A further possibility is that climate change will lead to more climate-related disasters like flooding and hurricanes and so on. This in turn will lead to migration, and next it may lead to conflicts. And a final argument is that natural disasters will weaken the states, because states that are unable to cope with the natural disasters and alleviate the consequences will be regarded with increasing distrust by their citizens, and that rebel movements will have greater opportunity to fight the government because the government will be weaker. So, what do we know about these various effects? Let's take rainfall first. It's evident from climate models that there will be changes in precipitation. Some areas will have more rainfall, others will have less rainfall. Sometimes the variability of the rainfall will be greater, and that rain obviously is important to human affairs, particularly in areas which are, or countries which are heavily dependent on rain-fed agriculture. So there are some studies which show that conflict in sub-Saharan Africa will increase in the year after year with reduced rainfall. But there are other studies that show that wetter years are more likely to see civil wars rather than drier years. So there's relatively little consistency and little consensus in this area. It seems that rainfall variability generally has a significant effect on lower level forms of political conflicts, local riots and so on, rather than direct challenges to the government. Oops. Now, a problem with some of these studies is that they're at the state level, and climate change obviously does not follow national boundaries, and conflict very frequently does not follow national boundaries, because most civil conflicts today are in a part of a country rather than encompassing the whole country. I mean, the classical example is Russia. It doesn't make sense to say that Russia is at civil war. There's a civil war going on in Chechnya, a very limited part of the country. And so if you want to know something about whether climate change could have an influence on the conflict in Chechnya, you obviously have to use disaggregated analysis. And this has been a trend in peace research in the past 10 years, that moving towards more disaggregated analysis. Obviously one stumbling block has been the lack of data, but such data both on conflict and on climate and other variables are being developed rapidly. And the best disaggregated analysis on drought and civil conflict in Africa showed that at this level there was actually no relationship. Another problem is that precipitation changes in Africa cannot really be predicted precisely from existing climate models. In other words, the problem is that where we have the best climate data is where the likelihood of conflict is the lowest. You can predict better precipitation changes in Norway, but it's not likely to be very relevant for civil war studies. A final problem is that most studies focus on weather rather than climate. Climate is defined by the IPCC as changes over longer periods, like 30 years. For a lot of time series, whether it's environmental data or economic data or conflict data, there's a lack of long time series. So people do studies over, let's say, a 20-year period, and they look at annual changes. And so you get results for weather and conflict rather than climate and conflict. Temperature. A frequently cited study from 2009 argued that higher temperatures in sub-Saharan Africa yield more conflict because of a negative impact on agriculture. These results are disputed. I think most students of armed conflict argue that because of lack of control variables, model specifications, a very short time series, and so on, these results are not valid. There's a vigorous debate going on. It is not by no means settled, but my view is that this study has been largely discredited. Interestingly, if you go back to the early 1970s, there was a report from the CIA that feared that global cooling would produce drought, famine, and political unrest. At that time, remember that people were more afraid of global cooling, the new ice age, than of global warming. That, of course, has changed completely. But interestingly, the effects were supposed to be rather similar. And I tend to think that this is in part because the job of CIA and indeed the military establishment is to always look for some crisis to which their military response can be relevant. And so environmental security has been quite popular in military circles once other enemies disappear. Now, of course, some of the traditional enemies are coming back with what Russia is doing in Ukraine and so on, so maybe there'll be less talk from the military establishment about environmental security. We'll see. And indeed, there are some studies that look at climate over a 1,000-year period and look at when wars are more common. And these studies seem to indicate, studies of China and studies of Europe, seem to indicate that it's during the cold periods that you have regimes collapsing and wars and so on. And of course, in a neo-Malthusian perspective, this makes sense because colder periods would generally be less conducive to food production and so on, and there'll be economic decline and crisis. But is this relevant for modern globalized and urbanized societies? That is much less certain. And in fact, the study of Europe by Richard Toll and others indicates that the relationship over this long 1,000-year period, once you get to the most recent 100 years, the relationship disappears and there is no relationship. But these studies are interesting because they really deal with climate and not with weather. Sea level rise. IPCC report in 2007 indicated that we could expect 12 to 43 centimeters sea level rise. That estimate has been increased in the most recent report. Some smaller islands, particularly in the Pacific, may be flooded. 1.2 billion people live in coastal areas, but of course most of them will not be strongly affected, and the number of people exposed annually to very serious disruptions is likely to be low, so therefore adaptation seems likely. People have time to migrate and countermeasures will be undertaken, building of dikes and so on. Urbanization will help because once you concentrate people in urban areas, you can build dikes and protection against 100-level storms, 100-year storms and that sort of thing at a lower cost per capita than you can do in rural areas. So urbanization will make it more feasible to take protective measures. Whoops. Migration. Migration is definitely a likely result of climate change. The human habitation will move as a result of a changing climate. But of course, human habitation is not stationary even today. There's a number, 200 million climate refugees, which you'll find in some environmental literature. This goes back to basically a back-of-the-envelope calculation by Norman Myers, and is not really, there's no scientific basis for that estimate, and in more recent studies it's been discarded. IPCC is no longer using it. But in any case, we know that in the next 50 years, hundreds of millions of people will move anyway as part of modernization and urbanization. Probably in the next 50 years, a few hundred million people move in China alone for reasons that have nothing to do with climate change. So if there are climate refugees, they will easily be swallowed up by this massive move towards urban areas. Now, what about the relationship between migration and conflict? There are studies showing that countries that host many refugees have a greater risk of civil war. And the reasons for that are generally seen to be that refugees take with them hostile attitudes, arms, and they may have kin in the host country, and so they bring the conflict along with the country from the country they flee into the new country. Economic refugees tend to be rather different. Economic refugees are more interested in establishing themselves, getting into the economy of the host country. And climate refugees will be economic refugees, and so it's highly questionable whether they will conform to the pattern of the conflict refugees. In fact, a lot of migration, and notably urbanization, is associated with greater wealth and lower conflicts. The relationship between urbanization and conflict is actually negative. Natural disasters. The number of hydrometeorological natural disasters is increasing. That seems to be established. There are more people affected by natural disasters, but paradoxically, fewer people die, because we are able to predict the natural disasters better, and we have more resources both at national and international level to save people from the worst consequences of these disasters. There's also a question whether the increase in the number of disasters is due to global warming, is it due to better reporting, and is it due to shifting settlements? In Norway, we now build residences in semi-rural areas, not on agricultural land because we want to save agricultural land, so we build them up on the hillside. And of course, up on the hillside, they're more exposed to mudslides and whatnot. There's an increase in the cost of natural disasters, but a lot of that is probably due to the fact that more high-value objects are insured. People have more to lose, and so that's more costly.
Thank you for reminding me. Shut up.
Some studies show that natural disasters lead to conflict, but this is mainly for geological disasters, which are unrelated to climate change. And the most recent studies show that the probability of conflict is actually reduced in the wake of disaster. And the reason for this is that people unite in the face of adversity. And the Aceh conflict in Indonesia, following tsunami, is an example. Countermeasures. Most of the studies that link climate change to conflict concern Africa. And the most plausible causal mechanism is that increasing temperature and rainfall anomalies affect rain-fed agriculture and provides for slower and reduced economic development, and then leading to conflict. Paul Collier has suggested a number of countermeasures to this. More effective irrigation, with drip irrigation rather than flooding, modified crops, industrialization, and urbanization. And so over a period of 50 to 100 years, adaptation should probably be feasible, even if this causal chain holds. IPCC has had 5 major assessments to date. There's little, if anything, about conflict in the first 2. From 2001, there have been 3 reports that are divided into 3 working groups, and it's a working group on impacts on adaptation and vulnerability that is really relevant. In the 2001 and 2007 reports, conflict was dealt with in scattered chapters, but based on very little peer-reviewed research, basically because there wasn't any, and they fell prey to the temptation of using grey area literature. A lot of inconsistencies, exaggerations, and weak documentation. Some sloganeering, like water wars and climate refugees, and sometimes a chain of citations, and if you try to follow it back, you ended up with where you were before. So people were citing each other in circular fashion. This is not unique to the IPCC, of course. But, and there were no authors in those reports who specialized in conflicts. Now, in the most recent report, this is a little bit different. There's a human security chapter that's rather well informed and balanced. And the conclusion of that chapter in the section on conflict is that collectively the research does not indicate a strong positive relationship between warming and armed conflict. Studies on rainfall deviation in the civil war are inconclusive. The 2 chapters on the emerging risks in Africa are a little more dramatic. But there's a chapter on methods which focuses on how robust the conclusions are, and this chapter completely dismisses the link between climate change and conflict. Different studies disagree, and most studies are about weather developing climates. So to some extent you can pick and choose in the IPCC report and find support for what we believe in, but I think the chapter 18 on methods is rather solid assessment. The human security chapter argues that factors known to be associated with conflict, such as low development and weak government, are influenced by climate change. And this is true, but if this mechanism was important, then studies would have found a consistent link between climate change and conflict, which they do not. The human security chapter tacitly assumes that the economic consequences of climate change are highly negative. But if you look at the economics chapter of the same report, it concludes that the aggregate global economic effect is a loss of 0.2 to 2% of GDP. In other words, GDP will continue growing, but it will grow a little bit less than if you hadn't had climate change. So what they say is that you lose less than a year's value, less than a year's economic growth. which is, of course, sad, but it's not the kind of disaster that's likely to lead to a major reversal of the trends in conflict. There's also in the human security chapter problematic use of the words like may and can. This may happen, this can happen. What does that mean? It can happen or it cannot. It may or may not. What are the research priorities? Very important to look at the interaction between climate change and political and economic factors. Under what conditions will climate change make conflict more likely? That, I think, is a key issue for research in this area. It's important to look at a broader set of conflicts. One-sided violence, violence by organized groups, including governments, against unorganized civilians, non-state conflicts, urban riots, that sort of thing. That work's just beginning. More disaggregated studies with georeference data, more precise models of local effects of climate change, balance the negative and positive effects. Food production may be reduced in Africa, but it could be increased in Siberia. And take account of long-term adaptation. In 2050, we'll be a lot richer. We'll also have money to spend on adaptation to climate change. Oops. And focus on the countries with low adaptive capacity. That's where the main problems are likely to be. So some conclusions. Man-made climate change is a major challenge, and it can be seen as a security issue in the very broad sense of security. But so far there's no robust support for the idea that climate change will lead to more armed conflicts. Other causes of conflict are much better established, and the current most serious conflicts like Syria, Ukraine and so on are unlikely to be caused by climate change. Climate change is not a new cause of concern. Countermeasures may also have adverse consequences. Obviously, China in many ways has moved from being a warfare state, both externally and internally. The economic growth in China has made it seem possible that China can emerge without being aggressive. It can become a modern society, and so on. Obviously, if you were to take the advice of some of the more extreme voices in the environmental movement to say that, well, we cannot allow China to develop because there will be even more emissions of CO2 gases and we have even more climate change. Obviously, if the Chinese were to take that seriously, which they will not, that could have other much more negative consequences if China went back to the kind of internal disruptions and external aggression that they have shown in the past. So uncertainty may be a major problem and the main reason to combat climate change. Thank you. And I've listed a few readings which you may be interested in.